Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. We have a full agenda today, and looking forward to providing you some good information on sound masking in the healthcare industry and how that could benefit your organization. For introductions, I am Charlie Crawford, the AV Practice Manager for Vision Technologies Audio Video Business. In a few minutes, I'll be joined by Balaz, who is the Field Sales Engineer for Cambridge Sound, to talk about the sound masking technology in healthcare. And just while I'm responsible for the AV practice today, in a prior role in my career, I was responsible for vertical product development in the telemedicine industry for video remote patient healthcare with one of the codec manufacturers. So it's great to have this opportunity to be working within a vertical healthcare application today. Before we get into the slides themselves, just wanted to let you know there will be a question and answer period at the end of the slides and presentation. There is a dialog box in your web browser to submit questions. You can do that at any point in time during the presentation. Our moderator will queue those up and we will address them at the tail end of the conference. Our contact information is also being provided, so if you have any follow-up questions after the webinar, you'll be able to call us up or reach out to us to get additional information. With that, next slide. A little bit about Vision Technologies. We're a service-disabled, veteran-owned business. We're headquartered in just outside of Baltimore, Maryland, and next to Baltimore Washington Airport. We offer a wide range of services that, with business units focusing on structured cable and data, centers, wireless, security, access control, surveillance, professional services, and audiovisual for presentation and collaboration. IP networking and data infrastructure is a common thread between our business units, as you will notice, and we are able to offer many of our clients one-stop shop services as a result of that, being able to provide multiple disciplines from one company. Our personnel in each of our business units are certified and have the domain expertise that you would need to provide assistance, whether it's AV, wireless, or the other services. One of the things that sets us apart from a lot of integrators is having the domain individual disciplines and not just trying to do everything. In addition to this, we're privately held, profitable, bondable to $25 million, and we've had 15 years of compounded profitable growth since our founding in 2000. Next slide. Just a little bit on some of the healthcare clients that we have supported in our past. A lot of these names will be very familiar to those on the call as some of the industry-leading hospitals. And if you're on the call and your name's not on the list, we'd love to have you join us on this list, or if we forgot to get you up there, we'll get that corrected and have you up there for the next time. So, but we've done a lot of work in healthcare from each of the business units over the past 15 years and are quite familiar with the requirements and the applications in the marketplace. Next slide. Just a quick overview of some of the capabilities that we have from our 5 business units and where they all kind of fit in and converge together in your building. We have the wireless, the distributed antenna systems, where if you need cellular coverage in your building and it's not available, we can extend that. Passive optical networks is another technology that's of interest in large institutions. LED lighting systems is another area, and digital signage, etc. Next slide. Next, okay. One of the things as you look at, and for those in the healthcare industry on the participating, you know this better than I, there's a lot of areas that you're looking at today for improving the patient experience, not just in a medical sense and remediation, but also their experience while they and their families are in the facility, including Wi-Fi coverage, information access through not just TV in a room, but also healthcare information, lighting controls, things like that. So a lot of these services or technologies ride on IP networks, data infrastructure, wireless infrastructure, and applications that are components that Vision Technologies can either provide, deploy, or manage and support for you. Next slide. Just a little bit about AV in the healthcare market. A lot of our capabilities run pretty broad. A lot of the commercial off-the-shelf systems for video conferencing and collaboration are applicable and directly usable in the healthcare market. There are some other products and capabilities that require specific equipment for patient encounters and diagnostic work, but a lot of the systems today can be readily used in the healthcare environment for continuing education and training, which is always an ongoing requirement. Digital signage can turn into wayfinder and information boards within the building to help patients navigate the facility. All the industries are constantly interviewing candidates and looking to improve the interview process, and video is a core component of improving the experience and interaction with a candidate for the first time. And then certainly consultation and interaction between medical professionals and peer consultation or specialty consultation. Video certainly enhances and makes the encounter more robust. Next slide. Collaboration is a key element in the marketplace today, not only in the enterprise but in healthcare. Everybody is concerned about how do we improve the decision-making process and the business workflow process, the patient workflow process, not only medically but the administrative components, and trying to reduce the time lag between components in the communication processes enabled by having a more collaborative environment. And this more and more clients are looking at how do they integrate a more robust experience in the workflow, and video is a core component of that to personalize the experience. The other thing that is coming into play in the collaborative environment is more office spaces are being designed in a very open architecture, which also increases the need for concerns and consideration for privacy and confidentiality in speech, which is where today's conversation is focused. Next slide. Just a few examples of some collaboration, everything from digital signage, traditional video conferencing systems on the right corner, video walls, operations environments on the bottom left, huddle spaces on the bottom left. Bottom right was a video wall, and then on the top left is a flexible space that has large 2x2 video wall of video displays on the wall, so they can have ad hoc employee meetings in this kind of a space. So just some various examples, pictures of some past work that we've done for clients in collaboration. Next slide. One of the things that truly differentiates Vision as a service provider is we go to market using the project methodology that's unique to Vision, which is integrated technology delivery. And the purpose of this is to work collaboratively with the client to understand the requirements, work with them to meet the requirements in a good, better, best design architecture, understand the cost and the capabilities, and then provide the engineering assistance to converge that down to the features they need at the price point that they have a budget for, and then deliver the project on time and on budget. So this is something where, as a follow-up to today's conference, if you're interested in more information, please don't hesitate to contact us, and we'll schedule a follow-up with you to give you more on our integrated technology delivery and how that could benefit your organization. Next up is Balazs is going to dig deeper into the Cambridge sound masking system and the healthcare application. So with that, Balazs, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I really appreciate it. That was great. This first slide right here kind of gives us, well, actually, at first, just a little bit about myself. As Charlie said, my name is Balazs Bulldog. I've been with Cambridge Sound now for a little over 4 years, and I kind of started off doing internal sales roles, kind of moved along into troubleshooting, and right now I'm out in the field. I'm actually out in the field right now in Orlando at a trade show. But I'm a field sales engineer and have been for about the last year, and in that time I've also installed quite a few thousand of our emitters working kind of a side job with one of our partners installing the product, and I can tell you from personal experience it is one of the easiest products to work with, and we'll certainly get some great uniform results. So with that being said, this is actually kind of one of my favorite slides right here, but it is also very general. And that's really why it is one of my favorites, is because sound masking is actually one of those new products that can really be installed just about everywhere. I've had the question today come up. Again, I'm at an ASIS, which is a security trade show in Orlando, and I've had a few people come up to me and ask me, where would we actually apply this? And really, the question is, to keep it from getting too specific, well, let me ask you this. Do you guys have any office space? Usually they're going to say yes. Are you finding that when you have a conversation, you can hear other people's conversations as well? Yes. That'll just about always be the case. If you can hear these conversations, is it safe to assume other people can hear your conversations? Yes, they are. Do you have any conference room areas or any area like that? Chances are they also have those areas. And is there any privacy issues in that kind of space? And almost certainly the answer is going to be yes. So now, instead of a product which is possibly seen as being somewhat specific to a vertical, we've taken it and we've really expanded it to just about anywhere. Sound masking is most likely one of the fastest growing categories deployed in corporate and healthcare spaces at the moment. But as this slide shows, government, we can do secured facilities, different service centers. With the acquisition of Dynasound, which I'm not going to get into too much today, but that further expands on our availability of product. So we now also offer an in-plenum system, which is the best system out there. All of the speakers are individually addressable, meaning that you can greatly update things as your floor plan or your layout changes. And more exciting is the fact that they've got a lot of products which we use for SCIFs, anti-espionage, and things like that. But enough about that. Vertical legal, we've seen a lot of growth there as well, especially around where you have the council and areas like that, especially with systems like our QTCRE, our privacy system. They can simply push a button, that system comes on and lets them know that the system's coming up online. Education, we are installed throughout many of the leading universities, especially in areas where you have more kind of collaboration areas. That seems to be a really popular and a pretty cool space as well. Retail spaces, venues, hospitality, finance, and then of course there's healthcare, which we're going to be talking about today. So without further ado, John, if you could move us over to the next slide. So some of the goals in today's presentation are going to be really understanding why some acoustical aspects are beyond critical for a healthcare type of situation. Most of these goals, I'm pretty sure you guys have a pretty good idea of, but we're going to take a much deeper dive into some of those. We're going to get into sound masking and some other things some light other products that you can also use to help out your clients in a healthcare kind of an environment. We're going to go over what HIPAA is, what HCAHPS is, and how that actually relates and can tie back in really to kind of justify a more aggressive budget for sound masking. And then really how sound masking is used to create just an overall more comfortable environment in which, staff can work better and in which patients can recover quicker. And we'll go over some quick testimonials. We have shared those links with you guys, I believe, so I'll really let you guys look over those case studies yourselves, but we can take a quick kind of high-level look at those as well. In my next slide, kind of enjoy this as this slide really kind of shows some of the safeguards that we're gonna read about here momentarily. So that right there, that's what you're getting with a lot of. So in this case, we're looking at a pharmacy, and that's it. So as far as a reasonable safeguard, you're kind of looking at it right there, and as you can imagine, it's probably not the most effective way to go about it. On the next slide here, what you actually see is HIPAA and the HCAHPS. On the next slide, we get into why these are so important for us. In HIPAA, essentially what HIPAA is doing, and there's another slide on that, no need to jump over to it just yet, but when it became very important, sorry about that, John, where it becomes very important is, thank you. So essentially what they said was that a client, or rather a company, must take reasonable safeguards to protect patient privacy. Unfortunately, it was very limited, as there was really no one defining what it was that they actually had to do or required a certain amount of protection. And again, there was no specifics as far as what safeguards actually had to be taken. So that all changed with the advent of HCAHPS. And then what HCAHPS did was, that's a survey. If we can go to that survey slide, what that has actually stated was that you can take a set of 10 questions, and it's an exit exam. It's a exit survey, I should say, and it asks these 10 questions. Amongst these 10 questions, one of them asks, how well did you sleep at night? And then really they were given 4 choices. Specifically it states, during your hospital stay, how often was the area around your room quiet at night? Never, sometimes, usually, and always are the answers that you could give to this. And this is really what has kind of been the motivating factor for hospitals to actually take some kind of safeguards and increase patient privacy, and not only patient privacy, but to do something about quieting down their rooms. So on the next slide, which is 15, it actually gives an idea of this and where HIPAA applies. So this is a really good one, because although it's based around healthcare, healthcare is really obviously quite a pretty broad vertical, and it encompasses everything from hospitals, different physicians' office, medical clinics, insurers, billing agencies, information system vendors, employers, etc. A lot of times what we actually see is, and I had a really big one in Cincinnati, was that it's not actually hospital, it's not actual medical space, but rather the administrative areas. And those same administrative areas that are dealing with all of the paperwork and a lot of that patient information, they still need to take those safeguards, which are now very important for HIPAA. And really, that's where sound masking comes really into the picture. On the next slide, this is really important. So this is one of the main take-home points here. So it's really defining speech privacy. So very importantly, speech privacy is the inability of an unintentional listener to understand another person's conversations. And this is important because it's not catching a word here and there. It's the actual ability to intelligibly understand a full conversation. So regardless of what kind of technology we're using, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to catch words here and there. But unless you can piece it all together and understand what's being said, that's really where you have these concerns. So as the first kind of statement here says, it's due to distraction caused by overheard conversations. And that is a really important distinguisher. You know, if you're sitting in an open office space, or in this case, if you're sitting in a patient room, for example, and you catch a word here and there, chances are you're going to get on with what it was that you were doing, either your work or, in the case of a hospital, getting about recovering. So trying to rest really is what that would come down to. If you're overhearing the conversation in the other room and you're overhearing a doctor's conversation with a patient, chances are your attention's going to be drawn to it. You'd be distracted. Not only that, but you're probably overhearing things that you'd just rather not hear. So with sound masking, we're able to block just about all of that conversation. So kind of as a signal-to-noise ratio, intelligibility does very much depend on the loudness of the overheard speech compared to the background noise. I like to use the analogy of say, a bar or being out at a restaurant. If you're chatting with someone across the room, not across the room, across the table, I should say, and it's pretty much an empty restaurant, your message is going to get through quite easily. As soon as you add some additional patrons to that restaurant and the sound level goes up, it becomes harder and harder to have a conversation with that person. What we see here is a privacy index. This gets us to where we actually kind of see how we can break this down in terms of percentages. So a percentage of 0 to about 60 or so is going to be just about unacceptable privacy. Usually means that a standard conversation can be very easily overheard. When we start to move from 60 to 80%, a conversation in many of the cases is probably where you are for a lot of open office spaces that have a minimal amount of treatment, no sound masking. They're probably even going to fall in a little bit lower. What we look to do is anywhere from about 80 to 95 for an open office type of an area. So in this case, say perhaps a larger waiting room with a reception area up front, that would be a pretty good way to look at an area like that. You certainly want those conversations to be as protected as possible. So if you remember that sign that we looked at before, that being a safeguard, well, it really isn't, is it? So with the advent of masking, we're able to achieve these kinds of levels without going and getting into things like more expensive construction materials, higher partitions, sound-absorptive materials. Anything 95 and above, you're really getting into confidential privacy, so that would be our goals for a private office kind of an area. Really, if you can get above those levels, you're nearly looking at SCIF level protection. So in our case, that would be, say, your patient rooms. So the conversations from one patient room to the next, we certainly want to do everything possible to protect those. So that's where we'd like to be for private offices. Next slide, please. So this, again, gets us back to the HCAHPS and what actually it is. So it's pronounced HCAHPS, and this is that questionnaire which a patient is given upon leaving the hospital. We touched on this a little bit before, but this is very important. The reason this becomes so important is because as of October in 2012, it's actually directly tied to a hospital's value-based purchasing program. So in short, depending on how high they can rate in these HCAHPS surveys, they get more money back. So the better they can do, the more money they're getting back. Now they actually have an incentive to go out and do something for patient privacy that'll let them get a better night's rest. That'll also greatly cut down on privacy issues, if not altogether eliminate them. And this one question that I mentioned before, the how well did you sleep at night, is our key to getting sound masking installed in a space. And as you'll see in the subsequent slides, we actually have tangible results with these installations in that healthcare kind of an environment. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting trends is when you look at how all of these categories scored, you notice that they're relatively high, for the most part probably in the low 80s or high 70s. In just about every case I could find, and I'll share a link with you guys where you can actually look up your own hospitals or facilities that you are familiar with as they relate to healthcare, of course. You can see how individual hospitals scored specifically in all of these different categories. And in just about every search I've ever done, quietness comes off as the last one, right? This isn't necessarily just quietness in terms of the medical equipment going off, but overhearing conversations, things like that. It is always at the bottom of the chain here, and is probably the main source of money that they're not getting back. In this case, you can see that the next one on here comes in 3% higher, and that's the explanations. So I know, at least from personal experience, when I'm given an explanation of what's going on, it can be fairly tough to understand. So all in all, quietness comes in at the bottom of the list, and good for us because that's where we can help out. Next one, please. So this is that website I told you about. So it's Medicare.gov. You can search either by zip code. You can actually put in the hospital's name. And then really nice thing is you can actually compare hospitals to one another. I think maybe it lets you compare up to 3, I believe. And in that situation, you can get a better idea of where you'd want to be treated or send someone to be treated based on these scores. So not only that, but it's a great way to get a conversation started. If you're visiting one of these facilities, either in regards to sound masking or in regards to another technology that you offer, it can be a conversation starter when you go in there and you mention how, I wouldn't necessarily start off mentioning how low they scored, but it could be kind of a prying question to ask of, what kind of issues are you having with patients and their comfort at night? And it'll definitely be a conversation starter that could certainly lead to some sound masking being installed as well as other equipment. On the next slide, what we see is how sleep disturbances actually happen. And really, it's fairly simple, but kind of written down here. Any kind of an increase in sound level is going to be the main contributing factor of waking up. Intermittent and impulsive kind of noises that are not constant are more likely to wake people up as opposed to fairly neutral content. So if you have, say, a fan, for example, that can almost help someone sleep, very much like sound masking, as compared to different beeping noises of medical equipment you may have, or people shouting in the corridor. So it's really those sudden sounds, and the more harsh they are, of course, the more noticeable they're going to be and disruptive. And with sound masking, so if we can keep those single event sound levels to about 8 and 10 decibels, that's where we're going to get the kind of the best results, or it's going to be not quite as noticeable. On the next slide, what we have are the different steps that we can actually take to design a sound masking system, or really just when we look around at a space, things that we need to consider for this space. These are called the ABCs of Acoustics. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. So A is for absorption. So whenever you look at your carpeting, your acoustical ceiling tiles, different wall panels, a lot of times you've got fabrics on the walls now that'll also act as an absorptive piece that can actually cut down on overall sound level. Even things like curtains. Anything warm and fuzzy in a room that's able to absorb that energy and burn some of it off is going to be doing some extent of absorption. B is fairly simple and possibly a quite obvious one. It's anything like walls, doors, cubicle partitions. Nowadays, we're really finding, and I've got a slide that goes over this in more detail, but you will find that those partitions are going down, they're coming down lower, walls aren't being built out, what have you. So there's being less and less of that blocking done, and a lot of times it actually relates to LEED certification and to making an open office space just more open. So a lot of that's been going away of late. And C is where sound masking actually comes into play. But it's not just sound masking. You can almost think of HVAC in certain instances as being a source of covering the sound. As a matter of fact, so can traffic noise. So can a TV or a radio. It really just depends. Any kind of an ambient background sound that's just kind of always there, bringing up the ambient sound level of a space, is really going to be covering up those sounds. So to a certain extent, possibly even acting as a certain amount of sound masking, although far from ideal in certain cases. It's probably better than nothing. So it'll be acting to quiet down the space with sounds that don't necessarily matter, that don't cause you to lose concentration like a conversation would. So anyways, in the next slide, we go over what sound masking actually is. And obviously it's quite important to note that sound masking is going to be the addition of a low-level engineered background sound. This sound level is played at anywhere from about 35 to 48 decibels. We live in a very small realm of volume of sound pressure that makes sound masking effective. We don't want to be too quiet or it won't be effective, and we certainly don't want to be too loud, as that just will not allow us to. That will become a distraction in and of itself. It just becomes a bit of a nuisance at that point. It's actually believed that one of the earliest forms of sound masking was the use of water fountains to mask the sound of chariots on cobblestone wheels. I've tried refuting that one, but good luck with that one. You have to go back in time to do that. An interesting fact is sound masking has actually been around since the 1950s and 60s, and it started by a consulting firm, an acoustical consulting firm here in Boston known as BBN, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. And they're actually one of the predecessors of Cambridge Sound Management. BBN, when they split, they formed two companies. One of them is Acoustics, which is a world leader in acoustical consulting to this day, and Cambridge Sound Management. So a little bit of masking history for you guys, but it's actually been around for that long. Although it's changed a lot in the way it's delivered, some systems, actually much of the Dynasound product line still utilizes these large speakers found up in the plenum space, which we'll get to in the next slide. So these are the design trends that I briefly mentioned before. So open areas obviously are becoming, I hate saying all of the rage because it's been happening for 30 years. So what we're also getting, though, along with these open plan areas is obviously the lower partition heights. Sometimes you've got a little strip of glass about 4 inches tall, maybe not even. Really, it serves more of a decorational function on top of the desk, and then you've got a person on the other end of the desk talking right at you. Well, guess what? That partition is not going to do a whole lot to discourage speech from making its way over to that side of the table. Cubicles are certainly getting much more denser and smaller. Architects absolutely adore the use of glass, marble, shiny things, open ceilings, things that make speech travel much easier. Although beautiful, right, as is an architect's job to sort of beautify and make the space more practical, they are certainly doing a great disservice to the sound transfer of this space. And a lot of that is actually driven by lower construction costs. The use of open ceilings, not filling it up, not putting a ceiling in there, they're able to save costs with. They're able to save costs by taking those partitions down lower. They're able to save as well by, obviously making smaller, denser cubes, but not bringing walls up all the way to the deck. That's extremely important. We see a lot of that, and it's and that's actually a main form or a reason why people actually look into getting masking is when they build out a facility, they don't realize how important building the walls to the deck is. But the nice thing is sound masking is much cheaper than actually going back through and building your walls up to the deck. But not only is it less expensive, it's also more effective. Another thing that has kind of led to kind of the proliferation of sound masking is, at least as we're seeing it, is the use of demountable walls. We do see a lot of demountable walls. They're really sold on the idea of being quick and easy to reconfigure, although I would say it's hardly used as such. But obviously with demountable walls, you're going to suffer in terms of acoustics, right? It's going to be much easier for sound to make its way up through the top of the ceiling, possibly even below it. walls to the deck, as I mentioned before, the use of glass and other reflective surfaces, and really just lowering construction costs. And you'll notice that these are just called enclosed areas. We don't call them private offices, as you may expect. And the reason is just that. They're hardly, these spaces are hardly private at this point. Much of that conversation bleeds over just like it would in an open office. Next slide. So I like this graph quite a bit because it really drives home the point that sound masking does make sense. You take your typical office space without sound masking, a 48-inch partition height. Sometimes you might not even have that. What seems to be really popular is a benching type of approach, you know, where people come in or employees come into the space, they pick out whatever desk they want, they throw up their laptop, and there's no use of partitions. It's just completely vast open. You take a pretty typical NRC rated 0.5 ceiling tile, and you're getting a PI, which is called a privacy index. It's a measurement that allows you to calculate the effectiveness of well, I guess of speech getting from a listener to, or from a source to a listener. Now we take the same space, we add a much better quality ceiling tile, all things remain the same. We've gone from that 58.83% all the way up to 73 almost 8%. And you've done so at, you know, fairly minimal cost. Now you take increased blocking, so all things remaining typical for that same office, but you're taking your partition heights up all the way to 80 inches, right? Employees are going to love this. It's going to look like a maze. However, the nice thing is it does greatly increase that privacy index, and you take it up all the way to 81.5%. The last slide there shows sound masking and how that would actually increase the PI in this space. That takes us up far more, and it allows us to do it in a manner which is much quicker, easier to install, and just sounds better. It's going to be more effective, and it still allows you to keep the LEED certification. So, as a matter of fact, it will contribute to it. In this slide here, what we're seeing is some key elements to an effective sound masking system. We've got a sound spectrum that has to be there. The levels need to be appropriate. You have to zone areas differently, and you have to cover the same continuous space as uniformly as possible. On the next slide, I believe we get into sound spectrum. Now, sound spectrum is an interesting one because it's fairly consistent with sound masking manufacturers. We were actually just reviewing how we would basically design a space, what kind of spectrums we would utilize, and then what our Dynasound partners would also do now. And they're nearly identical. So this is one of the few things that sound masking manufacturers can actually agree upon, and it's a comfortable sound masking spectrum, right? So it's an engineered sound. And what you see here is within that light blue shading, that's where you want to be. So long as you're in that, you're going to be okay, and it's going to make an effective sound masking system, as well as sound quite comfortable, right? Most people refer to it as a whooshing sound or a sound of airflow. And so long as you stay within that, you're going to be able to achieve it. We can modify it based on a lot of different aspects of the space. We do have full EQ functionality, which allows us to adjust that based on the space itself, the client, and their needs. Or if someone, a particular person's complaining, we can play around with the spectrum a little bit, make it a little bit more comfortable for them. So in the next slide, what you see is the, again, is the sound spectrum. What we hear all the time, everyone refers to this as either white noise or pink noise. The ones that use pink noise think they've got a one-up on the guys that say white noise. They're like, oh, I know it's not white noise, but it's pink noise, right? It's not. As you can see from the graph, it's really quite different. It's an engineered spectrum of sound. If we take either white noise or pink noise in its entirety and we use just that spectrum of sound, it's going to sound quite obnoxious. That's why sound masking has this spectrum of sound, which is meant to sound quite harmonious, really. So it's a relaxing sound. In the next slide, we go over the next element for sound masking. And that's going to be the level of sound. If you take just a quiet library, you're probably looking at about 30 or so dBA in that space. Your typical office conversation is going to be like 60 to 65. With someone, just having a chat in the office, a normal chat. Vacuum cleaner will get you probably just north of 70 or so dBA. When you look at the rest of this graph, usually what would happen is I would ask the question, well, where do you think sound masking comes into play here? And for those that don't know, they'd usually shoot up in the 60s, thinking that, well, okay, so if we're trying to mask conversations, you need to be at least 60. Well, we're not trying to block the conversation that the guy is having standing 3 feet away from you. We're trying to block all those other noises that you don't want to be hearing. So for us, going with 48 decibels at the loudest, we really don't want to exceed 48 dBA. That's going to really allow us to cut down this radius of distraction from, say, about 10 feet out from, actually, it depends so much on the space. But with sound masking, now you're only going to find that you're hearing the people that are, say, 2, maybe 3 cubicles out from where you are, so about 12 feet in an open office space. Once you get past that, it becomes very difficult to understand what's being said. And keep in mind, that's where the distraction is, as soon as you can understand those conversations. So some key elements. Another one's going to be proper zoning. This is really important because we do have so many different kinds of spaces. With our Cambridge product and it being direct field, it's quite easy to have the proper spectrum, but we still want to have proper zones. You're not going to want to have an open office area tuned, or rather dialed in at 48 dBA the same way that you would a private office. I said that kind of backwards. What I meant was you don't want that private office to also have a 48 dBA of sound masking because it's going to be far too loud for that type of a space. The expectancy in a private office, or a huddle room, or a conference room, smaller space, is that it is a fairly quiet space. Now, sound masking is very beneficial in those kinds of spaces as well when there's sound transfer from office to office, conference room to huddle room to what have you. So on the next slide, what we see here is uniformity as it relates to kind of a plenum-based system. And what you're getting is the speakers that you have are radiating up in a plenum space. And what this slide does not take into account is diffusion, so that should be a bit more even than this, but even still, with air returns and things of that nature, you're going to end up with hot and cold spots. Now, with the Cambridge system, we don't have to worry about that. Everything is direct field. There's nothing in the way of our signal coming down. So it's much easier to tune it. What we see in the next slide is a very traditional approach. Sound masking has not been done like this for some time, but my counterpart, who did my job prior to me, encountered this sound masking generator at, I forget the company, but that system has been up and running for some time. With ours, it's a little bit smaller. We're using about a single rack space to almost cover the same amount of space as this entire system was once using. So on the next slide, you see our approach to sound masking. So with this, it's got a much smaller footprint, but not only do we have a smaller footprint, and it's much easier to install, we have a far more uniform sound spectrum coming down. And really the reason is, it's quite simple. There's nothing in the way of that speaker or emitter. It's all coming directly to you and to your ear. The analogy that we would often use was if you were watching TV on your on your system at home, would you want the speakers to be up in your attic, or would you rather it be installed around you in that space in which you are in? And the answer should be quite obvious. Yeah, you'd want them direct. You'd want them facing you. So next slide, please. So here we see a patient wing and kind of example of how we would deploy sound masking. You see that highlighted space on the next slide? That's the actual patient room within this patient patient wing, I should say. Yeah, you're okay. You can forward over to that next slide. What you see here is a pretty common setup for a hospital space. You're actually utilizing 3 emitters in this space, and the reason for it is quite simple, but a lot of times we do get the question, well, why don't we just use one if we're only covering a single room? Well, the reason for that is localization, and it becomes more apparent in this kind of a case where if you've got a curtain, which is also separating beds as well, in that case you actually want a speaker to be located in those smaller areas as well, but the sound will, to a certain degree, still travel outside of those curtains, which allows us to get a more uniform sound throughout the space. We use the example of kind of like a fly in the room. So if you've got a fly in the room, you know exactly where it is. If you've got a bunch of flies and they're zipping all over the place, you're going to have a really tough time trying to figure out where they are because of where that sound's coming from. If you've only got one, you can localize on it almost immediately. Next slide. So in this kind of an application, right, you see at least 2 emitters being installed in each one of these patient rooms. Sound masking is always, and this is very important, and a concept that nearly everyone who's new to sound masking gets wrong. Sound masking is placed where you have the unintended listener. So you don't put it where, if you're looking to protect conversations, and the example I use is a conference room every time. If you're looking to protect conversations happening inside of that conference room, you wouldn't put the emitters inside of the conference room because it doesn't block sound. You would put it outside where you have those unintended listeners, and you bring up the ambient sound level with this engineered spectrum of sound to mask the conversation from making its way over to their ears. So in this case, when you look at the patient rooms, you don't want that conversation going from the from one patient room when a doctor's having a conversation with his or her patient, from making its way over to the adjacent patient rooms. This is also something that helps. So this obviously helps with the privacy aspect. And when we get into the overall benefit of sound masking, just bringing up that ambient sound level and having it in each one of these patient rooms, that's really what helps us with achieving that better night's rest that we have on the survey. Next slide. So what we have here now is you've seen the addition of the corridor and those orange dots. Each one of those dots, and excuse me if I didn't mention it before, is actually representative of our emitters. So each blue or orange dot that you now see is indicative of an emitter. The blue dots representing the patient room, so those are obviously zoned different so that they can play the appropriate sound level in those types of environments. It's pretty much range from about 35 to 38 dBA. In the corridor areas, because a lot of times it merges with a waiting room or a more open kind of environment, you can play those comfortably louder. And you'd probably want to play it louder so that it's more effective in blocking out those conversations. And then for that kind of a space, you're probably looking 45 to 48, with 45 being pretty much ideal. More of an open space, you'd probably want zoned differently, and you'd want that to be at around 48 or maybe just a little bit less. Next slide. So what you see here is that same patient wing, just in kind of a 3D overhead view. You see that those orange emitters are indicative of that that nurse call area. So that's where you've got the nurses. You want to give them their own sound level so that they can kind of tune that space to be ideal. Probably an ideal setting for that space, you're looking at about 48 or so dBA. The purple and surrounding zone, which goes over the corridor space, you're going to probably want that to be very close to 48. But the nice thing is you can utilize the corridors as kind of a progression into sound masking. So you can have it start off a little bit quieter, again, like 45 or 46.7, and then to merge into that slightly louder 48 space of that nurse call area. Then you've got a green zone, which is in all of the patient rooms. So you're utilizing a different zone for those types of spaces as well. The amount of emitters we use, it's always going to, again, for this kind of a space, you're looking at a minimum of 2, and that goes from 180 square feet up to 180 square feet. As you get above 180, you're going to want to add another one, and then another, and progressively, more or less it happens at about every 80 square feet that you add another emitter. When you get to about 500 square feet, you're just utilizing design practices based on our open office standards. One thing that I have yet to mention, and I don't think it comes up on the slides, is actually doing these system designs. So I know many of you have a good deal of experience with working with us at Cambridge, but I can't stress enough how important it is. If you have a project and you're looking to get design help on it, by all means, jump over to our website, cambridgesound.com, and you as partners can submit those projects right to us. We can get a budgetary quote turned around as quick as 2 hours. And our designs really don't take more than 2 to 3 days unless there's a huge backlog. Either way, it shouldn't be more than 3 days. And you don't pay for that design unless you actually win the project. It's just a great value-added service. So on the next slide, I think we get a little bit more into the zone layouts and such. And in this one, you see more specifically different exam rooms. And you have sort of a waiting area up in the front. You've got another type of counseling room, which is probably the light blue side or the light blue emitters. And again, really all that's showing is that it's zoned differently. It allows you to make adjustments to those zones in different ways than it would with others. Next slide. So the nice thing with healthcare is that kind of what we spoke about before, it can be extremely broad. So you're not only talking about exam rooms, corridors, waiting areas, admin, patient rooms, pharmacy. We also very much get into physician's office, a lot of pharmacy areas. We've given a lot of thought to doing kind of like a one box kind of fits all in terms of like a big box pharmacy area. They can all benefit from sound masking, and much of their areas are quite cookie cutter, so they all look fairly similar. So we could have kind of start moving forward with a very standardized approach to treating those kinds of spaces. That would be great. But again, HIPAA can be deployed in any space where we have confidentiality issues or issues just of distraction. So wherever there's a risk of someone overhearing potentially confidential information, you can certainly deploy sound masking. Next slide, please. So the case for acoustic privacy, and I love this one, no two people can ever agree on air quality, right? So I know from personal experience, me and my wife will sit there watching a movie, and I will be wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and she will practically have on like fuzzy boots with a light jacket, what have you, and she's still cold, and I'm too warm. So no two people can just about, and the same applies to an office. So it's really hard to agree on thermal comfort. Well, if you look at acoustic privacy, it actually scores lower, so towards that extremely dissatisfied area, as opposed to one more for thermal comfort, which was rated higher. So people in general are really dissatisfied with the acoustic privacy of their space. Next slide, please. So in this graph here, and this is nice because it takes almost 30,000 respondents, and it's actually telling us that 54% of workers actually feel they're individual workers. And of that time, they spend 80% of their time actually doing individual workers, as opposed to only 46% of collaborators actually doing 61% of their time collaborating. The bottom line in that graph, next slide please, is that more and more people are just individual workers no matter how much we're sold on the idea of being collaborative. This is a very common application here, open and private offices. Even in a healthcare type of environment, keep in mind in healthcare you've got a ton of administrative spaces as well. So again, in that case, we're looking to treat those open office areas. Those open office areas have wide-ranging issues. They can be anything from distraction from one colleague talking to the next and trying to cut down on their distractions to actually overhearing conversations from a private office that they should not be hearing. So these are those case studies that I'm not really going to get into. You're welcome to check them out online, but this is basically just backing up on with case studies some of the installs that we've had. So in this one, Tracy mentions that sound masking is really just a perfect example of how much they considered everything in this space to really promote healing and comfort. Next one. So Kettering Medical Center, what I like in this one was the patients noticed the added sense of quietness and telling nurses without being needed to prompt, and they actually do like the masking so much that they miss it when they're gone. So next one, please. So again, approximately 4 months after we installed the sound masking system, and this one's quite important, our hospital post-stay press GANI survey of 57 patients on the issue of noise in and around the room showed a dramatic 33% increase in patient satisfaction. When we think back to, next slide please, when we think back to that graph that showed us how low, how quiet your room was, that's a huge increase. So that puts us right into that 80 percentile, if not better, of feeling like they've done a good job. So that's a huge increase. I like this one quite a bit because this actually takes into account 3 hospitals in which we installed sound masking around the greater Boston area. So kind of collaboratively, or all 3 of these spaces, when masking was installed, this is showing us how these hospital scores have actually improved. Whereas national and state averages are, you know, very much staying the same. It's very much a flat graph. With the advent of masking and installation of masking, you can see some quite dramatic increases in those scores. So, next slide, please. So some sound masking myths. HVAC is not a substitute for sound masking. If it would be, we'd all be, we selling sound masking would be out of the job. There's just no way to make a sound masking that effective. If we had the full spectrum of sound in it, it could be, but it never is. Not only that, but uniformity is also an issue. Sound masking does not cancel sound, we're merely masking it. Sound masking does not block sound. For all of the times I've seen a design in which sound masking was installed as a curtain, so to speak, around a conference room, it'd be very rich, and I wish I would have had the conversation with them before they actually install it like that. Sound masking doesn't prevent face-to-face conversations. You do need to be outside of a ring of about 12 or so feet, depending on the type of space. Sound masking certainly does not cause headaches or is detrimental to health. I have gotten that question quite a bit, but usually those people are suffering from something else, which leads them to believe that it might be the masking causing it. Sound masking doesn't interfere with hearing aids or cochlear implants. We're really just replicating the sound or the spectrum of speech, of human speech. So we do not interfere with any of those. Next slide, please. So thank you much for your participation and everything, and hopefully you guys have some questions for me or Charlie that we can go over.
All right, well, I don't think we have any questions at the moment. If you have a question, please enter them through the dialog box on your web browser. We'll pause a moment. Thank you for your attendance and participation today. We hope this has been an informative briefing on the benefits of sound masking and privacy for the healthcare space. Certainly you have our contact information there on the screen currently. A copy of the presentation will be available following the webinar, so that will be coming to you if you're interested. And with that, any questions? Our allotted hour is up, so thank you for your time today and joining us, and we look forward to meeting with you on a future webinar. Thank you for participating.